Okay, so last time we talked about validity and invalidity and soundness and unsoundness. Today we're going to do a few different things. First, I'll just tell you what logic is. Logic as a discipline is the study of the rules or guidelines that govern inferences. That's a pretty broad account of what logic is. Typically, when people talk about logic, like if you take a course in logic, you're not going to learn about the rules or guidelines that govern all kinds of inferences. Specifically, you're not going to learn about the rules that govern inductive inferences. Those are typically in statistics classes, not in logic classes. And you're not going to learn about the rules that govern abductive inferences. That's in part because it's very controversial how abduction works, so there aren't really classes teaching you how to do abduction. Instead, your kind of entire education, if you're taking a science, and or I should say not just a science, but any kind of truth-conducive discipline. So if you're taking any kind of science, you're trying to get at the truth, and your entire education is kind of shaping you to learn how to do abduction properly. Or if you're taking, say, history, you're learning how to do abduction in history properly. You might be majoring in something where the goal isn't to sort of identify true theories. Like if you're majoring in modern dance, the goal isn't to identify true theories. But for many different majors, you kind of pick up on the ways abduction works in that discipline by taking that discipline. We'll talk a little bit about abduction in the scientific reasoning portion of the course, but again, it's not something that people have kind of formalized in the way they have statistics for induction and logic for deduction. At any rate, when people use the term logic, they're often talking about the study of those rules that govern deductive inference only. So they use logic as a term for deductive inference. And that's how, like, logic, when you take a class in logic, it's almost invariably deductive logic that's at issue. And thus, we can think of logic as the study of deductive arguments and deductive reasoning more generally. Okay, so how do we represent deductive arguments? Well, I mentioned this in a previous segment, but I'll just say it again. We identify and number each premise and each conclusion. We write P or premise in the brackets after each premise, and we write C or conclusion in the brackets after each conclusion. We list the premises that most directly lead to a conclusion after writing the word conclusion. So if we have an argument with three premises and one conclusion, and those three premises together yield that one conclusion, after we write the word conclusion, we write from premises 1 through 3. So you list the premises that most directly lead to the conclusion after writing conclusion. If a conclusion C1 of a prior argument is a premise in a future argument for another conclusion C2, you would list that conclusion C1 as a premise for C2, but you wouldn't list the premises that led to conclusion C1. Now, I know that's abstract, but here's the basic idea. Suppose I say this. If I'm a duck, then I have feathers. I'm a duck, therefore I have feathers. If I have feathers, then I can fly. I have feathers, therefore I can fly. Now, I made a little argument to conclude that I have feathers. But when I'm saying how I reached the conclusion that I can fly, all I would list is the premises representing the fact that I have feathers and the fact that if I have feathers, then I can fly. Why don't I need to list those previous premises, the ones about me being a duck? Because I've already listed them as the way I reached the conclusion that I have feathers. So they've already been accounted for. Again, that's a bit abstract, but it will become clear as we go through examples what I have in mind. Be sure to add intermediate conclusions. That is, conclusions you're drawing along the way, like in that argument I just gave, I have feathers was an intermediate conclusion, and to eliminate any superfluous claims. So when you're making an argument and you list a bunch of premises and then you have a conclusion, if there's any premise that isn't used to reach a conclusion, it's not really a premise and you should get it out of there. To include it in an argument shows, one, that you don't really understand what an argument is, but two, and more importantly for practical purposes, it's distracting. Tracking arguments that are trying to describe the real world, that are trying to help us figure out how the world works, can be rather difficult. And having superfluous claims that aren't doing any work, claims that are extra, that aren't driving towards a conclusion, is just distracting. Get them out. Okay? And that's all I'm going to say for the sort of basic vocab of logic. We'll continue next time by actually starting to look at some rules of logic.